Take a look at a modern map of Vienna and you'll notice that its historic centre is ringed by a street in a polygon shape. The Ringstrasse, or Ring Street, is a boulevard that was built in the mid-19th century in the place where the old city walls once stood. The style of the buildings erected along the Ringstrasse is what one labels historicism. That means that everything the architects designed was inspired by the spirit of foregone historic European architectural styles, but the designs were adapted with the technological and functional abilities of the modern 19th century world. Neo-Baroque, Neo-Gothic, Neo-Renaissance were all chosen to best express the building's function. The Parlament, in a Hellenistic style, harks back to classical Athens and the birth of democracy. The Neo-Gothic City Hall pays tribute to the free civic estates of the Middle Ages. The Neo-Renaissance style of the university symbolizes humanism and science during the learning age of the Renaissance. The Imperial Forum drew influence from the Roman Empire. The idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk, meaning total work of art, is synonymous with the historicism style at the Ringstrasse. This means that the entire Ringstrasse, alongside the individual buildings, were looked at as works of art. The sculptures, paintings, and decorations that adorned the buildings were also essential elements for the architects to implement. During the Ringstrasse era, the Habsburg monarchy was the second largest territorial state in Europe. Its population ranked at third highest, with some 50 million people at the beginning of the 20th century. But the multi-ethnic state was militarily weaker than it had been in the past. In the architecture of the Ringstrasse, we see a reflection of how the Habsburg monarchy projected itself. Today, the entire ring is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its magnificence stuns visitors and inhabitants of Vienna. So, let's see what we can uncover about the society of its day by diving deep into the ring's history. Ever since the 13th century, the historic city centre of Vienna had been confined behind walls. The wall, with its bastions, managed to repel many sieges, including against the Ottoman Empire in 1529 and 1683 respectively. By this time, the wall had a system of moats and what was called the glacis. The glacis was this large strip of meadow just outside the fortifications that was kept free of buildings for artillery to have a clear line of fire. By the late 18th century, the glacis, just like the walls, were classed as militarily obsolete. Therefore, the glacis became more of a recreational area filled with pedestrian paths, carriage roads, and avenue trees, and it became a beloved place where the Viennese could stroll around. After Napoleon's troops blew up a part of the wall in 1809 with ease, demonstrating that the walls were no longer enough to offer protection from modern warfare, and the revolution of 1848 showed that the walls were useless in protecting you from your own subjects, thoughts to remove the wall began to take place. But ultimately, it was the fact that the wall stood in the way of the urbanization of a rapidly growing city. In the year 1850, the adjacent suburbs on the other side of Vienna's walls were finally recognized as part of the city and became city districts. The walls now blocked the historic first district of Vienna to the connecting suburbs, becoming a large obstacle for the ever-growing traffic and expansion of the empire's capital city. Action was required. With more and more people living without a place to call home, drifting from room to room, sleeping in stables, cellars, or out on the streets, pressure was growing for the government to take action. Vienna's first freely elected mayor, Johann Caspar von Zeile, put forward in July 1857 a number of points to reform the city and tackle urban expansion, which included that the inner city must be expanded, that owners of factories should be required to build housing for their workers, that tax exemptions for new construction and renovations be extended, and to make building regulations less strict. Also during the 1850s, Karl Ludwig von Bruck, the finance minister of the Austrian Empire, and the minister of interior, Alexander von Bach, had independently from one another also begun to take the issue of urban expansion seriously. The finance minister Bruck maintained contact with wealthy private individuals such as nobles, bankers, and industrialists who supported the simultaneous construction of the necessary infrastructure alongside private financing of non-state construction and purchasing of land. Bruck's plan was not to burden the already wavering state budget, but he soon fell behind Alexander von Bach. Bach had secretly prepared a project for the complete redesign of Vienna in line with the contemporary neo-absolutist concept of the state. That means that the urban expansion was to appear as a gracious gift from the emperor to his subjects. The Kaiser liked this idea, so the construction of the Ringstrasse thus originally became a state-directed project. So it was that during Christmas of 1857, the news on people's mind in Vienna was the emperor's announcement of a Christmas gift. Because on the 20th of December, the young Franz Joseph, just 9 years into his reign as Austrian emperor, announced the destruction of the city walls in a decree addressed to Interior Minister Bach. It famously began with the words, "It is my will," and went on to explain that the imperial capital walls are to be removed and a broad ring-shaped boulevard to be put in its place. A building fund to utilize the newly available land was to be established and the creation of park spaces guaranteed. This is all part of a larger announcement, a contest that urged architects to draw up and submit their own designs for the boulevard. The news was mainly met with approval. A wave of enthusiasm across Vienna vastly increased Franz Josef's popularity. But there was of course criticism and doubts. Some lamented the tree-lined avenues of the Glacis and being able to stroll along the wall. Some within the military feared damage to the security of the city and the imperial court. The Viennese painter Friedrich von Ameling wished to keep the walls and the Glacis for aesthetic reasons. But the decision was made, and Interior Minister Bach was not a man to waste time. Already on the 31st of January 1858, the architectural competition had officially begun. In March of the same year, demolition of the walls begun at the Rottenturmtor, which is this part of the wall on the Danube Canal, and we can see the demolition works taking place in this photograph. Over the next years, Vienna would become one big construction site. Thousands of migrants from all across the empire were called in to do the actual work. The majority of the workers coming from Bohemia, and the speed of the project is thanks to their hard work in horrible conditions. Without thousands of unnamed female and male workers earning next to nothing for back-breaking labour, there would be no Ringstrasse. As the wall was already coming down, 85 submitted projects for the design of the to-be boulevard were evaluated by a jury. In December 1858, 3 of the best submissions were chosen and a separate committee combined them to develop a general urban expansion plan. The creation of 2 parallel main roads, the Ringstrasse and a freight road, monumental buildings on both sides of the Ringstrasse, the expansion of the Hofburg and the construction of the city park, all this and more were included in this plan. At the beginning of his reign, Franz Josef ruled a neo-absolute state that resembled a military dictatorship. The trauma of the 1848 revolution was stuck in the minds of the imperial elites. While at first it is not quite so obvious, this trauma is reflected in the design of the Ringstrasse. Firstly, it is nearly 57 meters wide. The wide streets would make it hard for revolutionaries to create barricades from which to hold strategic positions from. The Ringstrasse's polygon shape, that doesn't really resemble a ring, is no accident. Instead of a curved road, the long straight sections allow for a clear line of fire. The fences around the Burggarten, Volksgarten and Heldenplatz all have this kind of stone foundation. These foundations are at a perfect height so that an infantryman can kneel behind it, take position, commence firing while keeping the upper body concealed and behind cover. These fences strategically surround the Hofburg, the residence of the imperial family, creating a defensive wall in disguise as a simple, innocent fence. Additionally, on either side of the Ringstrasse, 2 barracks stood, the Franz Josef barracks and the Rossauer barracks. These barracks were located relatively close to railway stations so that supply chains, in the event of an uprising, were secure, and fresh troops could easily be transported into the city. The street Kollengasse was designed to be ever so slightly wider so that troops could easily march out of the Rossauer barracks. This is still evident in the size of the street today. These precautions are not surprising because as demolition works continued, the Austrian Empire's political situation was rapidly changing. After a defeat in 1859 against Piedmont, Sardinia and France, the Austrians lost the Kingdom of Lombardy and Franz Josef's neo-absolutist control started to decline. A bitter defeat against Prussia at Königgrätz in 1866 would prove that Austria was no longer the superpower it once claimed to be. During a time of military setbacks, the Austrian Empire sought to hawk back at its glorious past. The Baroque era was when Austria had been militarily successful and expanded its borders to their furthest extent. Under the reign of Charles VI, the architect Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach expressed Austria's successes through Baroque architecture. Neo-Baroque thus became an important architectural style for imperial projects on the Ringstrasse as to remind citizens in a waning empire of their glorious past. All in all, 2.4 million square meters of land was made available for construction. About 1.5 million square meters of that was allocated for streets, squares, and parks. A little under half of the land was designated for buildings and was mostly sold to private individuals from the upper bourgeoisie. These entrepreneurs could receive a 30-year property tax exemption if they built a residential block within 4 years of owning a plot. The money they spent on purchasing this land went straight into an urban expansion fund. 220 million crowns flowed into the urban expansion fund from private sales of land. This money was then put back into urban expansion. In this way, private construction of residential buildings and palaces financed a large part of the public buildings along the Ringstrasse. By 1864, most of the wall had been demolished, and on the 1st of May 1865, the Emperor Franz Joseph, alongside the Empress Elizabeth and many other royals, ministers and representatives, ceremoniously opened the first part of the ring leading up to the Burgtor. Now we know a little bit about the historical context and construction of the Ringstrasse itself, let's take a closer look at some of its magnificent buildings and see what they can teach us about the history of Vienna and the Austrian Empire. Let's begin with the first new building that was constructed on the ring, that is the Votiv Church. On the 18th of February 1853, as Vienna's walls were still standing strong, a self-proclaimed patriot and tailor's apprentice, János Libany, wielding a kitchen knife, attacked the 23-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph. Two men, Colonel Count O'Donnell and a Viennese citizen named Joseph Ettenreich, who happened to be standing nearby, managed to overpower the assassin. The Emperor's life was saved, and Franz Joseph came away with just a small cut to the neck. This was headline news, and the idea to construct a church to thank God for saving Emperor Franz Joseph's life took up speed. A funding campaign for the erection of a church was led by Franz Joseph's younger brother, Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian. A patriotic readiness to donate was expected of the empire's subjects, and over 300,000 individuals would end up donating, including people outside of the empire as far away as Egypt and Syria. The chosen location was just outside the yet-to-be-demolished walls on the Josefstädter Glacis. A competition for the design was won by a young architect, Heinrich von Förster, who was a complete beginner and would go on to become one of the most important Ringstrasse architects. The foundation stone was laid on the 24th of April 1856 in the presence of and on the second wedding anniversary of Kaiser Franz Joseph and Kaiserin Elizabeth. Despite the plentiful donations, financial difficulties slowed the initial rapid progress, and construction of the church would take more than 20 years. It was in December 1873, on the 25th anniversary of Franz Joseph's reign, that the bells of the Votiv Church would ring out for the first time. The ceremonial consecration took place 5.5 years later, on the 24th of April 1879, this time on the 25th wedding anniversary of Franz Joseph and Elizabeth. The church is styled as a French High Gothic cathedral, making it the first building of strict historicism in Vienna. The twin tower facade, the ambulatory around the choir, and the ring of chapels serve as clear indicators of neo-Gothic architecture. Two tall towers dominate the front of the church, which is enriched by numerous figures from biblical characters and local saints of the Habsburg monarchy. The front of the church points towards Vienna's most important sacral building, St. Stephan's Cathedral. The church is reversed as its apse is orientated to the west instead of east. This clearly expresses that the church was primarily created as a monument, its function as a spiritual place falling to the foreground. As is typical of historicism, the architect Ferstel combined the French Gothic style with other German forms of Gothic. The church's choir is inspired by Cologne Cathedral's choir, while the elevated star vault at the crossing takes as its model the great cathedral of Amiens. The exterior is dominated by forms of French Gothic, for example the rose window above the central portal and a crossing tower. Medieval Gothic churches would not be medieval Gothic churches without stained glass windows, thus they are found in the neo-Gothic Votiv Church. Most of the stained glass windows were however destroyed during the Second World War. Only the Kaiserfenster could be reconstructed. All the others were redesigned. A window is dedicated to Franz Jägerstätter, a pious sacristan from Upper Austria who refused military service during World War II as a conscientious objector and would end up being executed for it. Another window depicts the Todesstiege, or Death Staircase, which was the gauntly staircase in the quarry of the Mauthausen concentration camp, where thousands died under the lead of the Nazis. Here it is depicted as the Way of the Cross, with Christ carrying the cross up the stairs, accompanied by prisoners. In the lower left corner, we can see a priest in prisoner clothing. This is a portrayal of Heinrich Meyer, who was executed by Hitler's regime on the 22nd of March 1945. This church is not just a place of worship, but also is a building filled with references to Austria's cultural remembrance and national identity. The landscape southwest of the historic center of Vienna was the only area where rivers didn't naturally flow. Therefore, it was from this point that an invader could best attack the city. And that's why the Hofburg developed as a fortress exactly in this location. Since the High Middle Ages, the Hofburg had been constantly expanded with new wings being added to it to accommodate the growing Habsburg court. The Hofburg, with its location right next to the city walls, could not be ignored from the massive amount of space that was about to be freed up next to it. But a redesign of the area had already begun long before the walls were to be demolished. To commemorate the 10th year anniversary of the Battle of Leipzig, the Burgtor had been erected as a monument to victory over Napoleon, who had in 1809 destroyed a section of the wall here. Construction was finished in 1824 and it served no military function but holds a significance for Vienna similar to that of the Brandenburg Tor in Berlin or the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The side facing the Ringstrasse is built in exposed brick and resembles the fortress architecture of Renaissance Verona. The Hofburg facing side features classical motifs such as the Doric columns. Thus, long before the Ringstrasse was planned, construction in the spirit of historicism had already begun. For centuries, the Habsburgs had bore the title of German king and ruled as Holy Roman Emperors. Although the Holy Roman Empire had at this point ceased to exist, the Habsburgs still saw themselves as the legitimate successors to Rome, and they drew on the architectural style of the Roman Imperial Forum. With the Burgtor in the center, an Imperial Forum was planned, stretching out from the Baroque court stables, today's Museum Quartier, and the Leopold wing of the Hofburg to create an imperial zone. This was to be the only square in the Ringstrasse that spread out onto both sides of the street. As liberal reforms began to emerge, the Habsburgs continued to find themselves legitimizing their monarchy as one of culture and science. That's why inside this forum, two court museums were to be built, the Museum of Art History and the Natural History Museum. Art and science were meant to immortalize Habsburg rule. This shift from the usual patronage of religious buildings reflects how society was thinking in the second half of the 19th century. In 1869, the German architect Gottfried Semper was brought to Vienna. Semper's plan was to visually unite the two court museums with the two new massive symmetrical wings that were to be attached to the Hofburg. He also wanted to construct triumphal arches over the Ringstrasse to mark the entrance into the imperial zone. The ancient Roman Forum of Trajan served as the model for today's Heldenplatz, which was to be enclosed in a semicircle by two symmetrical wings called the Neue Hofburg. The museum buildings were constructed on the other side of the Ringstrasse, today's Maria-Theresienplatz. Many of these ambitious plans were never completed. The Imperial Forum thus remains unfinished and reflects the fall of the Habsburg monarchy. Of the West Wing, only the Natural History Museum stands. The corresponding West Wing of the Neue Hofburg was never built, as we can see in this satellite image. The triumphal arches were also never built. On the completed wing of the Neue Hofburg, the windows of the ground floor were modelled on the arcade arches of the Colosseum. Statues placed between the arched windows represent different periods of Austrian history. The sequence begins with a Germanic warrior, a Markoman, followed by a Roman legionary, and then a Boulevard, who symbolizes victory over the Romans. Further down the line, we find a Magyar. Next to him stands a Crusader. Some of the statues on the other side include a Tyroler Schütze, a Viennese citizen during the 1683 siege of Vienna, of which I have made a video on, standing next to a Polish rider from the same year. We can see the Turkish half moon here, symbolizing victory over the Ottomans. Each of these statues can tell us a lot about Austrian history, but let's turn our attention back to the building itself. This ramp leads up to a covered carriage hall. That hall had been requested by Archduchess Sophie, the wife of the heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, simply so that in case it was raining, she could depart her carriage without getting her feet wet. Above the entrance portal runs a frieze. In reliefs decorated with oak branches are the initials of the Emperor, FJ, flanked by those of the Empress, E, making it clear whose palace this was. This frieze can also be seen on the two museums inside the Imperial Forum and on many other Ringstrasse buildings that the Emperor himself had invested in. The Neue Hofburg is crowned by 4 bronze goddesses of victory standing underneath a double-headed eagle. The double-headed eagle had symbolized the Holy Roman Empire since the 15th century, and it was adopted by the Habsburgs as the emblem of the Austrian Empire after the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution. The double-headed eagle bears the house crown of the Habsburger Rudolf II, which in 1804 was elevated to the Austrian imperial crown. This symbolism identifies the Neue Burg as the residence of the Austrian emperor. Inside the Neue Hofburg, it becomes clear that some of this building was only completed after the First World War. In this section, we can see that the wall is no longer made of this expensive marble, but simply plastered. What had once been the second largest state in Europe had plunged during the First World War to a tiny and poor nation state. Back outside, 2 statues mirror each other on the Heldenplatz. They were meant to complement the 2 mirroring wings of the Neue Hofburg. This statue is of the great war hero of the Baroque era, Prince Eugene of Savoy. He defeated what the Habsburgs called their eternal enemies, meaning the Ottomans and the French. This second statue is of Archduke Charles, the man who defeated Napoleon outside Vienna at the Battle of Aspen on the 21st to 22nd of May, 1809, turning himself into a symbol of Habsburg dynastic strength. In a heroic pose, Prince Eugene has his back turned to the east, to be understood as towards the Ottoman Empire. Archduke Charles has his back to the west, towards France. The inscription on Prince Eugene's pedestal reads, "Wise advisor of 3 emperors," meaning Leopold I, Joseph I, and Charles VI. The coat of arms and double-headed eagles decorating the pedestal of Archduke Charles makes it obvious to the viewer that he is a member of the Habsburg dynasty. On the other side of the Ringstrasse, the 2 art and natural history museums standing opposite each other demonstrate that art and science are equally valued. The architect Semper designed the 2 museum buildings as total works of art. The Renaissance was of course an era when art and science flourished. Therefore Semper presents us these museums in the style of the Renaissance, but infused them with Baroque elements. The shape of the domes on top of the museums is a reference to the imperial crown of the 10th century, which in the 19th century was believed to be dated to the time of Charlemagne. Once again, even after renouncing the title of Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburgs continued to see themselves as the legitimate successors of the Roman emperors. Architecturally speaking, the dome originates from the realm of religious architecture, giving the museums an almost sacral-like appearance. One striking difference between the two museums are the 5-meter high bronze statues standing on the domes. The Art History Museum has a statue of the wise and peace-loving Pallas Athena, while the Natural History Museum has a statue that represents the most essential thing to life on Earth, the sun, embodied by the Greek god Helios. In the middle of this Baroque-styled park between the two museums stands a monument to Maria Theresa, who ruled Austria de facto for 40 years in the 18th century. She greets us with her right hand. Her left hand is holding a scepter and rests on the Pragmatic Sanction. The Pragmatic Sanction was a fundamental law of the Habsburg monarchy, which allowed female succession. She was the only female ruler in Habsburg history to pass power down onto her sons. Finally, we encounter a form of female representation on the Ringstrasse. But Maria Theresa is not depicted alone. She is surrounded by 4 allegories of princely virtues: strength with sword and shield, wisdom with a mirror and a book, justice with a sword and a law book, and clemency with a palm branch, recalling Christ. Underneath her on the front side are her statesmen. To the right are the administrative reformers, to her back are the generals, and to her left stand scholars and artists, including a young Mozart. A defining part of the monument are the 4 mounted army commanders. At the front are those from the 7 Years' War, Daun and Laudon. On the other side, we find generals from the War of the Austrian Succession, Traun and Kievenhülle. Instead of a crown, Maria Theresa wears a diadem. This was because at a time of national conflicts within a multi-ethnic empire, the question of which crown she should wear, either the Bohemian crown, Hungarian or Austrian crown, was impossible to resolve. As a counterpart to the Imperial Forum, the rising liberal bourgeoisie manifested itself in the creation of a Civic Forum. On the outer side of the Ringstrasse, the university, parliament, city hall were all erected and intended to show the achievements of the rising bourgeoisie. For me, the buildings in this section of the ring rank as some of the most beautiful in Vienna, but the original concept of the Ringstrasse did not include any buildings here at all. The whole area was meant to remain a drill and parade ground for the military. Only after the emperor finally decided to abandon that idea on the 18th of August 1668, it was made possible to construct these monumental civic buildings in opposition to the Habsburgs' claim to absolutist rule. The Imperial Constitution of 26th of February 1861, or the so-called February Patent, is seen as the birth certificate of Austrian parliamentarism. For the first time, the Reichsrat, or Imperial Council, was called as a bicameral parliament to decide on financial and military affairs of the whole state. The need for a representative home for this new institution went without saying. Franz Josef, alongside a committee, commissioned the Danish architect Theophil Hansen, who had been working in Vienna since 1846, to construct a building for this purpose. The foundation stone was laid on the 2nd of September 1874. 9 years later, the first session was held by the House of Deputies on the 4th of December 1883. In the days of the monarchy, the parliament was simply known as the Reichsrat building. The architect Hansen knew that the Reichsrat building would become the most symbolic structure of the entire Ringstrasse, as the emergence of parliamentarism in the Danubian monarchy represented a new era. Parliament buildings in many countries often draw on national history in their presentation. This is of course not clearly possible in a multi-ethnic state as that of the Danubian monarchy. No shared historical narrative could be agreed upon for all members. In the spirit of historicism, an easy solution was found. Hansen had previously lived and worked in Athens for 8 years and was entranced by ancient Greece, and he chose to use Greek antiquity as there was a historical connection. The Athenians being regarded as pioneers of democracy. The educated bourgeoisie of the 19th century also loved this sort of thing and enjoyed to glorify Greek classicism. Hansen modelled the main entrance of the Parliament on the Erechtheion of the Acropolis in Athens. The Parliament stands like a majestic temple, as it's not built directly on the Ringstrasse, but placed slightly back from it. In doing so, the Parliament is distanced from the day-to-day hustle and bustle on the Ringstrasse. Hansen knew very well that ancient buildings would have originally been painted in bright colours, and he actually didn't want to leave the Parliament building in white, but a coloured design was rejected for financial reasons. A large statue personifying Austria was also originally planned in front of the Parliament building. This idea was, however, abandoned out of consideration for the political sensitivities of the various nationalities within the empire. A good compromise was settled, and still today stands a goddess who symbolizes wisdom as well as strategy, tactics, and internal peace, Pallas Athena. The two figures next to her represent legislative and executive powers. The personification of legislation holds a tablet of law, and the personification of executive powers, meaning the enforcement of laws, is seen here with the symbol of justice, a set of scales, while in her other hand she presents a sword of judgment. The figures are surrounded by statues representing the principal rivers of the monarchy. At the front, the Danube turns towards the only male statue, representing the river Inn. On the Parliament side, the Moldau is represented here holding a rudder, standing next to a statue representing the Elbe. Placed in the fountain basin, they indicate the geographical scope that the parliamentarians who work in the empire's vast Reichsrat debate over. From this parliament, with the proclamation of the First Republic of Austria on the 12th of November 1918, the end of the monarchy was sealed. The use of the term Reichsrat disappeared, and today only Reichsratsstrasse behind the Parliament recalls it. The former chamber of the House of Deputies in the northern wing now serves as the meeting hall of the Federal Assembly, while in the southern chamber, which was destroyed during the Second World War, the Austrian National Council now holds its sessions. The Parliament is probably the most important building on the Ring, and happens to also be one of the most beautiful buildings in all of Austria. But let's now move on to the next part of the Civic Forum, the City Hall. The City Hall, with its huge main tower, smaller turrets, round arches, pinnacles and arcades, could easily lead one to mistake it for a medieval Gothic cathedral. And indeed, some sarcastic Viennese mockingly called it a cathedral for the mayor. Vienna was a rapidly growing city, ever expanding into adjacent suburbs. By 1910, it would reach over 2 million inhabitants. As a result, more and more responsibilities fell onto the shoulders of the city administration. The City Hall is the only Ringstrasse building that was funded by the city of Vienna herself. For the competition, a total of 64 designs were submitted. The design by Friedrich Schmidt, the Dombaumeister of St. Stephan's Cathedral, was selected. Schmidt chose the Gothic style to allude to the urban self-government in the late Middle Ages. For inspiration, Schmidt looked to the Flemish town halls of the same era. Schmidt, however, was a true historicist, and he did not build in a purely Gothic manner. For example, the design of the corner pavilions draws on Baroque palace architecture, but the use of Gothic was a clever way of the liberal bourgeoisie to emancipate themselves from the imperial style of the Habsburgs. The 97.9 meter high central tower obviously had the intent to visually express the city's claim to leadership. The shape of the tower recalls the belfry of the Brussels Town Hall, and its spire resembles the spire of the North Tower of Antwerp Cathedral. For the design competition, an imperial decree stated that the City Hall tower was not allowed to exceed the 99 meter high towers of the Votiv Church. Schmidt managed a clever workaround, and he placed a statue known as the Rathausmann, or the Town Hall Man, on top of the tower. And if you include the Rathausmann, the tower reaches a total height of 104.3 meters. The Rathausmann himself is 3.4 meters tall and holds a 5.4 meter flagstaff. He wears a replica of the armor of Emperor Maximilian I. The real armor was made in 1485 in Augsburg by Lorenz Helmschmidt and can be seen in the Armory collection of the Art History Museum of Vienna. The fact that the bourgeoisie drew on a historical ruler's suit of armor suggests how Vienna's bourgeoisie looked in some ways towards the imperial court for orientation. In the Vienna of 1880, only 3% of the population was eligible to vote, and only men. Therefore, the sculptures and statues of the city hall are not a reflection of the people of Vienna, but rather that of the upper bourgeoisie and the men in particular projecting themselves. The city hall was completed in 1883, and it has representative halls and the offices required for modern administration.
These days, the space in front of the town hall is used for all kinds of public events, and there's almost always something to do here.
Let's now turn our attention to the final building of the Civic Forum, the university. Vienna's old university had become a place of unrest during the revolutionary year of 1848. For this reason, the imperial court considered building a new university out of the city centre and to spread the individual faculties across various suburbs. It was thanks to the persuasive work done by Vienna's mayor, Cajetan Felder, who got the idea of a single building for the university to be created on the ring to be agreed upon. Heinrich Ferstel, the same architect who designed the Votiv Church, was commissioned to develop plans for the new university building. Ferstel combined Italian High Renaissance with elements of Baroque palace architecture. With the Renaissance style, the architect is alluding to the golden age of humanism. The famous old universities of Padua and Genoa served as models for the university building in Vienna. The once residence of the Spanish Habsburger Philip II, the Escorial, was used as a model for the ground plan of the university. The university on the Ringstrasse was opened on the 11th of October 1884. The peaceful inner courtyard feels reminiscent of a monastery and holds 150 busts of famous scholars. On the 22nd of June 1936 at 9:20 a.m, on the so-called philosopher's staircase of the university, a student named Hans Nelbuck shot his teacher, Professor Dr. Moritz Schlick. The National Socialists released the murderer from prison in 1938, and Nelbuck lived on in Vienna without consequence even after the end of World War II. A commemorative inscription in the ground recalls this event. The main hall of the university features two statues, one of Rudolf IV, who founded the University of Vienna in 1365, making it the oldest university in the German-speaking world, by the way. The other statue is of Maria Theresa, who made many educational reforms during her reign. The artists Gustav Klimt and Franz March were commissioned to decorate the ceiling with allegorical paintings to the university's facilities. We can see the central panel known as Triumph of Light over Darkness and the facility allegory painting Theology. Both of these works are painted by Franz March. Gustav Klimt's facility allegories, however, were to cause a scandal. Klimt presented his first completed facility painting, Philosophy, at the Secession exhibition in 1900. 87 university professors rejected the work, saying that it was too erotic and too metaphysical. The following year, Klimt presented Medicine, which was once again met with harsh criticism. It was taken so seriously that it was even discussed within the imperial court, and the Minister of Education came under heavy attack. By the time Klimt completed Jurisprudence, most of the public had fallen behind Klimt, but the people in charge didn't stand up for him and rejected his works. In the end, Klimt ended up keeping his paintings and returned the money he had already received to make them. During the Second World War, they were destroyed in a fire, and that is why today there stands just black and white replicas on the ceiling. As we have already touched on, we now know that for centuries the church and the military had been what held up the Habsburg Empire. By the second half of the 19th century, religion was losing its grip and the emperor's army began to suffer many defeats. Franz Joseph turned to the arts to legitimize his rule. On one hand, we have already seen the court museums that were built in the area of the Imperial Forum, but on the other, a place for music and theatre was needed. The main building dedicated to this was to be Vienna's new court opera house. The architects August Sicard von Sicardsburg and Edward van der Null used the Basilica Palladiana in Vicenza as a visual reference for their design and won the international competition for the construction's design.
Construction work began as early as December 1861, and by 1865 the structural shell of the opera house was completed. The now legendary Neo-Renaissance Opera House was fantastically successful when it did finally open, but until that point it faced an unbelievable amount of ungrounded criticism, yet if not outrage or disgust, from the public.
In the original plans, the opera was to form the centerpiece of 3 buildings. From the opera, you were meant to have an unobstructed view over some low buildings out towards the Karlskirche. But this was not to be. Heinrich Drascher, a brick manufacturer who supplied materials for many Ringstrasse buildings, was pissed off that the opera was to use a cast iron framework rather than his bricks. Heinrich went off and bought the land opposite the opera and had the Heinrichshof built in his name, which at the time became one of the most luxurious apartment buildings in the world. The Heinrichshof would be so heavily damaged during World War II that it was completely demolished afterwards. But by the time the opera was finished, it was suffocated behind the Heinrichshof.
The press began to criticize the lowness of the opera house, but the lowness of the opera house was caused by the Ringstrasse itself being raised by 1 meter after construction of the opera house had already begun, causing the grand staircase of the opera house to be reduced to just 3 simple steps. This, alongside Vienna becoming one big construction site, really pissed the public off.
Despite neither of these things being at the fault of the 2 architects, most of the blame was shifted towards them. Insulting nicknames such as Versunkenen Kiste, meaning sunken chest, were circulated. Supposedly, Emperor Franz Joseph remarked upon inspection that the people are right, the building does lie too low in the ground. After the emperor criticized the building, on the 3rd of April 1868, the architect Eduard van der Nul took his own life. The second architect, Sighardsburg, suffered from tuberculosis and died on the 11th of June of the same year. According to legend, Franz Joseph was so deeply afflicted by the architect's death that he would no longer give out criticism. A simple, "It was very nice. I enjoyed it very much," would henceforth be the emperor's choice of remark. Despite the tragic death of both architects, construction continued, and on the 25th of May 1869, the opera house opened with a performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni. As with many things, after the opera house opened, most of the criticism was soon forgotten about, and it was finally appreciated by the general public. In fact, the opera house was so successful, it became a model for theatre buildings throughout the Danubian monarchy. From the 1880s onwards, the architects Ferdinand Fellner and Hermann Helmer constructed nearly 50 theatre buildings using the Vienna Opera House as their model. In the arches of the first floor, we can see 5 bronze statues. They embody the allegories that define the world of opera. From left to right, those are heroism, tragedy, artistic imagination, comedy, and love. On top of the opera, we see an inscription simply reading Kaiser Franz Joseph, making it clear that it was the emperor who funded this project. On the 12th of March 1945, American bombs hit the opera. There were somehow no fatalities, but the auditorium and stage areas were completely destroyed. The opera was rebuilt and reopened on the 5th of November 1955 and continues to be filled daily for performances. Until now, we have focused mainly on museums, imperial, religious, civic, and public buildings. But of course, this was not even the majority of what was built on the Ringstrasse. Private residential construction through the erection of 650 palaces and rental buildings financed a significant share of the public buildings on the Ringstrasse, as the money for the land sold for these buildings entered a fund that would go back into urban development. The super rich upper bourgeoisie thus became the central driving force of the Ringstrasse's development. The first hotel on the Ringstrasse was opened on the 10th of May 1870, but the building was originally constructed as a residential block, Before hotels on the Ringstrasse were permitted, in 1866, the to-be owner of the Grand Hotel, Anton Schneider, converted his building so that it could offer furnished rooms to rent. When Schneider finally got the permission to officially open as a hotel, an in-house cafe, bar and restaurant was added. Anyone who paid for a room also paid for a meal in the restaurant. The hotel was at the forefront of the technology of its day. It had a steam-powered lift, and every room its own telephone, every floor its own bathroom, and the lobby had a beauty salon. With such luxury, the hotel became a social meeting point. The in-house laundry service and stables made the Grand Hotel a self-contained world for the super rich. The aristocracy and upper bourgeoisie who missed the chance to build their own palaces on the Ringstrasse began renting rooms here instead. Notably, this is where Larisch stayed and played the role as mediator between the meetings of Mary Vetzera and Crown Prince Rudolf, which would end in a tragic murder-suicide in Meiling, a topic of which I have made a very detailed documentary about, and I recommend you watch it after this. Nearing the fall of the monarchy, the old War Ministry building was becoming too small for the empire. The site of the former Franz Josef barracks was given up and the new Kriegsministerium, War Ministry building, was to be erected here. Ludwig Baumann, the most beloved architect of Franz Ferdinand, won the design competition in 1907.
Due to major foreign defeats, the Habsburgs liked to remind the empire's population of their great successes during the Baroque era. Thus, Neo-Baroque had become the choice of imperial style in the final days of the monarchy, standing in huge contrast to the latest style of the time, Jugendstil.
From a technical standpoint, the new War Ministry building was highly modern and provided space for around 2,000 employees. There are 48 different warrior busts surrounding the outside of the building, staring down at passers-by. They are sculpted in a variety of uniforms to show the army's diversity. They are, however, not depicted in contemporary uniforms, but those from the 18th and 19th centuries. Two entrances are guarded by sculptures of Roman warriors. The massive 40-ton bronze double-headed eagle, which was demanded by Franz Ferdinand, symbolizes the dynasty. The surrounding warriors represent the multi-ethnic empire's army, without which the state could not exist. In front of the War Ministry is a monument to Field Marshal Radetzky. This Bohemian was the most important Austrian military leader of the 19th century. The Radetzky March, composed by Johann Strauss, a piece that is still performed at every New Year's concert in Vienna, makes sure that he will stay strong in the mind of Austrians for years and years to come. Once again, we see that the monuments built by the state all the way up to the end of the monarchy in the early 20th century sought to glorify past victories from centuries gone by.
The Ringstrasse is truly one of a kind. The mixing of over 2,000 years of European architectural styles lets one's imagination run wild. But upon precise research, we have unfolded a myriad of stories and references that simply reflect the Austrian Empire of the mid to late 19th century. The magnificent parks on the Ringstrasse that are today open and enjoyed by all make it an attractive place to come and hang out. I really like the Ringstrasse and I look forward to making more videos about Vienna. So please do subscribe, like and comment. It supports me a lot and I wish you all the best. Until next time.